We are fortunate in the bleeding disorders community to have a number of thoughtful, compassionate, and energetic leaders, but none who are quite like Laurie Kelley. For the past 27 years, Laurie has dedicated herself to educating and improving the lives of families impacted by hemophilia, von Willebrand disease, and inhibitors, both here in the United States and internationally throughout the developing world. So as we say goodbye to 2017 and hello to 2018, what are some of the major considerations for our community, both domestically and globally? That's what we're here to discuss. Welcome to episode 10, or our Bleeding Disorders Across the Globe episode of the Ask the Expert podcast. I'm your host, Patrick James Lynch, and today's guest is Laurie Kelley. Laurie is the mother of a person with hemophilia and founded L.A. Kelley Communications in 1990 to provide practical educational materials for families. She's the author of 10 books on bleeding disorders, including Raising a Child with Hemophilia and A Guide to Living with von Willebrand disease. Laurie is the founder and editor of the quarterly Parent Empowerment newsletter, commonly referred to as PEN. She also founded Project Share, a humanitarian program that donates millions of dollars worth of blood clotting medicine annually to patients living in developing countries. And Laurie is the founder and president of Save One Life, a nonprofit child sponsorship agency for children with bleeding disorders in developing countries. So, Laurie joins us today to give an overview of her work in the community for the past 27 years, both domestically and abroad, and to share her unique perspective on what's most important for our community to be thinking about as we roll into the new year. That conversation's coming up in just a moment, right after this quick word from, well, me again. Just before we get to this interview, I just want to take a minute to talk with you about what it is that I'm doing over here with Bloodstream Media and podcasting for the bleeding disorders community. My company, Believe Limited, started Bloodstream Media to create a network of podcasts, a network of free audio resources for people affected by bleeding disorders. The Bloodstream podcast hits on big news, big stories, and interviews with active community members, and uses contributions from the community to spotlight the various segments of our population. I co-host that with my wife, yoga instructor and doula, Natalie. The Powering Through podcast features panel conversations on obstacles, challenges, and what it takes to overcome. It features community members and special guests, and is recorded in front of live community audiences. The Bloodline series is our This American Lifestyle series, featuring deep dives into important community topics. Our first series on life with von Willebrand disease is composed of over 24 interviews with patients, clinicians, and thought leaders, and, if I may, is super cool and unlike anything else that's out there. And, of course, we have this podcast, Ask the Expert, featuring interviews with community experts on treatment, lifestyle, and advocacy issues. I'm really proud of what we've been able to do with these pods and the thousands of community members that we have reached through them. I think we are balancing entertainment, education, and empowerment really well and creating truly engaging, resourceful podcasts. But I need your help. I need your help to make sure that we keep reaching more people, because while awareness of podcasts is at an all-time high, there are still many people who don't exactly know what they are or how to find them. And sometimes I meet community members who have never heard of podcasts, and I just know that they are exactly the type of people who would benefit from listening to Bloodstream Media's pods. So, you're listening. Obviously, you figured out how to engage with podcasts. Nicely done. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Please leave us a review on iTunes if you haven't already. And please help one person you know find their way to listening to this episode. Maybe a community parent that you know who's nervous about the new school year, or maybe a volunteer in your local community who can help share this with more parents in your area. I'm a big proponent of the value of podcasts and a big believer in the power of community. If our community gets behind pushing out podcasts as a form of communicating, educating, and empowering one another, we'll be stronger and better for it. All right, that's the end of my pitch. Thanks for listening. Okay, so I am joined now by Laurie Kelley. Laurie, how are you?
I'm well, thanks. How are you, Patrick?
I'm doing excellent, and thanks for coming on Ask the Expert. You have a very unique position within the hemophilia and greater bleeding disorders community. So I'm excited to hear your perspective on where we stand as we move from 2017 and into 2018. I'm sure the vast majority of people listening are familiar with your work to some degree or another. Perhaps they're familiar with your work and don't know that you're the person behind that work. So just to level set for us right here at the beginning, could you give us a general overview of Laurie Kelley Communications and Save One Life?
Sure. I founded both organizations. One is a private organization, Laurie Kelley Communications, and one is a registered nonprofit, which is Save One Life. Laurie Kelley Communications was created to address educational needs at the time in the bleeding disorders community. That was back in 1990 when I was founded. So things were quite different back then. But in general, we continue doing the same work that we did even back then. We publish original and groundbreaking books and publications on all kinds of bleeding disorders, hemophilia, von Willebrand disease, inhibitors, and we have a collection of children's books, and I would dare to say that we probably have the biggest collection of hemophilia and bleeding disorder books in the world. We publish newsletters like Penn and Penn's Insurance Pulse. We do presentations, symposia, market research for pharmaceutical companies. And we have a full-time staff of 3, and I'm one of them. But we have a lot of subcontractors to back us up, like writers and editors and designers. Save One Life is, again, an international nonprofit, a registered 501c3. I'm the president and founder, but we have a board of directors, staff of 4 now, and we work globally outside of the U.S., and we support directly children and young adults in developing countries who have bleeding disorders through one-to-one sponsorships and college scholarships, micro-enterprise grants, and summer camps.
So you mentioned, talking specifically about Laurie Kelley Communications first, you mentioned you founded it in 1990 and began creating educational resources right away. And you mentioned things were quite different back then than they are today. Obviously, we don't have the time to go through the 27 years of how things have changed, but broadly speaking, what have been some of the major inflection points or hurdles or leapfrog moments in bleeding disorders education throughout these 27 years?
Yeah, you're right. We don't have time to cover 27 years, but I would say that one of the biggest differences is just logistically. Back in 1990, we had no cell phones, no internet. So when your baby was diagnosed, you were sent home, and you couldn't even find other parents unless your HTC told you, and they weren't really allowed to tell you. So you left your name with them, hoping they might connect you with somebody. And sometimes they offered support group meetings, which ours did, fortunately. So we met a few parents, but I could count on one hand the number of people I knew with hemophilia, and my son was one of them. So we were really limited and isolated. Nobody could really go to annual meetings. It was just a very different environment back then. We were very isolated. And in fact, that's what led me to write my book, was to give families a way to share their stories with one another in a structured way. So our book was filled with quotes from 150 families. We had corded telephones. We had to meet in person if we wanted to share something. So that's kind of the logistical structure we were dealing with. That changed tremendously with the onset of the internet, and then eventually emails, and then, of course, the star was social media. That created an amazing, amazing network of families where halfway around the world you could just plug into social media and instantly find somebody and instantly talk to somebody. So it has, I would have to say Facebook alone has just revolutionized hemophilia support and care. But looking back at, I'd say, major moments within the community, not just like communications and in general, I would say some real milestones were the first. Well, my son was born in 1987, and at that time, the whole community was embroiled in the HIV scandal. So when my son was born, it was like, oh, you just have hemophilia, you don't have the rest of this. So we were kind of ignored in many ways, and that's why I gravitated towards the non-HIV community. I didn't live with HIV, and our community, sub-community, needed that attention. So a major moment was when we overcame that HIV crisis we were in. Lawsuits were being launched against pharma, against the government. Settlements were being reached. Eventually, that quieted down. We were still losing people, of course, all the time, but the initial real crisis had started to finally pass. And between that and then the internet, and then the focus being put eventually on the non-HIV community, the young parents, the babies, then things started to really change. Social media came along, people were connecting, the community started healing more. And that was a huge difference. It was like night and day. A lot of us were scared. It seemed like all people talked about was death and dying. And we had a future to look at, and we didn't know what to do. So eventually that settled down. And then came a new threat, and that was the insurance. So back as far as 2005, we started publishing articles on the changing insurance landscape and kind of warning people things are really going to change again. We had changes before with HIV, but now things were going to change in our access to care and coverage. And at first we were told, we were like Chicken Little, the sky's falling, but a really wise visionary, Dave Medeiros, who was a person with hemophilia and HIV, had told me about all these changes and urged me to publish them, which I did. And everything Dave said came true. It's incredible. Back then I didn't even know what half the insurance terms were, but I learned and watched as everything unfolded just as he said it would. The other thing that I noticed over 27 years was inhibitors. Even 10 years into our community, 12 years into our community, nobody talked about inhibitors. They were like the ugly stepchild people didn't want around. And even some of my very close friends in New England that I've known for years and had children with inhibitors, they never shared their burden with anyone. So finally, I have to commend Novo Nordisk for stepping forward and creating the Inhibitor Summits. And at those initial meetings, it was like watching our community back in the 1980s all over again, crying, pouring their heart out. So the focus on inhibitors became paramount, and it was fantastic to see them getting the resources that they needed as a, quote, sub-community. And then lastly, I think the global focus. I've been working in the global field since 1996. And again, you feel like you're a pioneer out in the wilderness without any support. And I think there was basically just the World Federation, the work I was doing, and some HTCs here and there, and also some of the European organizations trying to work in developing countries. But we were all very scattered and not coordinated. Now there's a concerted, coordinated effort to help the people in developing countries. And there's many people responsible for that, but that's been a huge change. So those are the major areas.
That's a fantastic overview. One small point that I do want to highlight that you brought up is when you were starting the work or the focus on insurance, you mentioned, not knowing what half the terms meant, but you learned. And I kind of grabbed that because I've had that experience as well in my work within the community, finding myself kind of continually in areas that I was ignorant of or minimally literate in, but the ability to learn and just figure out what this means, figure out how to improve your abilities as an advocate, as a communicator. I think it's good to remind ourselves that we have the ability to learn. We don't have to walk into a situation as an expert, but if we walk into it open-minded and with a willingness to learn, little by little, maybe we become that expert. So I just wanted to underscore that point amidst the litany of fantastic highlights that you just provided. Then just looking at this past year, we are obviously in a kind of rapidly changing insurance and product pipeline landscape. Are there any unique challenges when it comes to educating and communicating with the greater community that you have come across just in this past year, given the current climate?
Yes. First, I have to say, when we started educating the community about insurance so many years ago, about 8 or 9 years ago, people were just thunderstruck. They couldn't believe that. What happened was we were victims of our own success. After the HIV crisis started to settle down and payments and settlements were made and safer products came out, then people finally went back to enjoying some life. And the insurance industry wouldn't touch us with a 10-foot pole. They were scared of us. We had terrorized people with our ferocious advocacy. So we had about 10 good years where pharma couldn't do enough to make us happy, and insurance companies wouldn't dare stir up the pot. But that finally came to an end. And what happened is skyrocketing prices combined with limited state budgets. Medicaid was the kind of the ground zero where all of this was being formed. Finally, the insurance company said, okay, enough, Mr. Nice Guy, we really got to cut costs. And so little by little, it started to snowball. And this year, of course, we've seen a tremendous change, and some of it is definitely political, as we all know. There's been a discontent in the insurance companies have to cut costs. They have to. Medicaid is the states are demanding it. It's crushing their budgets. Chronic disorders like hemophilia make up a huge part of the Medicaid budget. So something had to be done. And we prepared the community for the Affordable Care Act pre-ACA, during the ACA, and then post-ACA. And we predicted, of course, it's like giving a kid, your teenager, a credit card with no limit. Where's the money going to come from? Eventually, the bills have to get paid. So now we are seeing what was predicted, a backlash. It's not even political. It just makes sense that there's going to be a backlash. The money has to be found to pay for all of this. And whatever administration is in office is going to do what it can to help that, and while trying to take care of its people. So right now we're seeing threats again. We had threats before. We thought we found a solution, and now we're having threats again. So poor National Hemophilia Foundation and Hemophilia Federation of America get no rest, and the state organizations, everybody has to stay on their toes, reading constantly about what are the changes, who's trying to push what through, what are they going to cut next, and then it comes down to your own individual policy. So I can't stress enough, every single person, even if you're on a public assistance and you think you've got a caseworker who's going to take care of you, no one's going to take care of you. You have to read your policy cover to cover. And I'm telling my own staff this too, and believe me, my daughter works for me, and I'm telling her this. Put aside money. You've got to start saving money. If you have a health care crisis, could be just even a hospital stay, you are going to have to pay some money out of pocket like never before. So protect yourself by putting aside some money for each person in your family for their medical bills, because you will have to deal with that at some point. We're all starting to see that. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges I've seen this coming year. The other thing is I have to praise our community from the top to the bottom, because everybody has been working to educate patients and families, and they've been doing a marvelous job. I've seen it with my own eyes, that when we started to go out into the public to educate about insurance, people didn't know what basic terms were. They didn't know what ACA was. Then they started, 5 years into it, they start peppering us with questions and demanding answers. And I love it because it shows they have learned. Some have learned the hard way. Some have learned just through trying to take preparations. So I think that we've done a great job of educating people, but we have to keep it up. There's no rest at this point.
It's probably worth mentioning too, for listeners' benefit, you also have a unique perspective on how the community, to the point you made about watching the community adopt more understanding of insurance and how to advocate, because you spent many years going around the country with a program called Pulse on the Road, directly interacting with community and working with policy experts at NHF to make sure that the community education and literacy was rising. So just want to make the point that you know this from direct firsthand experience all across the country. So I think it's good to hear that you saw that trend occur, and here's hoping that we continue to support people's ongoing education, as it's not as though any of this is getting simpler.
That's right. That's right. And people should really get in tune with, I would say, first and foremost, their state organization, and find out from them. Get on their radar. I've had people from somewhere in the South contact me for insurance advice, and I'm like, you've got to work with the people in your state, because every state is different and every policy is different. And I don't know your state. I only know one person in the whole world who knows that, and that's Michelle Rice of NHF. She knows everything in every state, but I don't. So I always ask them to get on the mailing list of your local organization, attend their meetings, and call them and talk to them. Talk to your HTC social worker. But you have to play your part in this and be proactive.
So switching gears again and thinking about the global community. So Save One Life, if I have my information here correct, was you founded that 10 years after Laurie Kelley Communications. So since 2000, Save One Life has been operating. And this morning when I was preparing for our call, I was looking at the timeline. I have it up in my computer now, from saveonelife.net, the website, and looking at 2006 increased the total number of sponsored beneficiaries by 59% to 177. Jump forward a few more years, 2010, it had increased from the previous year 21%, now up to 680. And we jump to, the last year here is 2014, up 12% to 1,140. How many sponsored beneficiaries do you know? 2017 is obviously not complete yet, but do you have a ballpark of where 2017 will land?
Yeah, I think right now, we're sponsoring about 1,400 children and young adults in 13 countries, 13 developing countries.
So that's, that must be very satisfying growth. Obviously, the needs around the world are great. There's so much work to be done, so can't spend too much time being proud of ourselves, so to speak. But what Save One Life has accomplished in its lifetime is extraordinary. So can you give us a little bit of a perspective, 2000 to 2017? What are some of the differences in hemophilia treatment and management in the developing world just in the last 17 years or so? What developments have we made, and what are the areas where there is still a significant ways to go?
Great questions. I have to say, we started off pretty small, and we wanted to keep Save One Life small for a few years because it was a prototype. We didn't actually know if this program was going to work. No one had ever done anything quite like it for a small chronic disorder. And when we decided to go big time in 2008, well, that's the global market crash. And I kept thinking, we're doing really well in this country. We should be able to help other people. And unfortunately, I still don't think the country's quite recovered from the global meltdown of 2008. So I would like to say that we were in a better place by now, but it's been a struggle because a lot of families in the U.S. are hurting, and we recognize that. So we don't want to forget our brothers and sisters overseas who are really living in some desperate situations, but we recognize that families here too have had lots of challenges. So again, one of the biggest differences I've seen, again, it goes back to the social media has revolutionized access to care for these families, because back in the day, I would have families, back when Russia did not have factor, believe it or not. Now they've got all the factor they need, but I remember when Russia didn't have any factor, and mothers would handwrite, I still have the letters, on yellow lined paper to me. It would take 10 days to get to me, and then I would reply to them, which would take another 10 days. 20 days later, a child in needing factor, as the damage is done. Now I'm getting messages, Facebook messages, 11 o'clock at night, 1 o'clock in the morning, and seriously, within 24 hours, we can get factor shipped out to people because our company donates factor. So we're able to reach community members all throughout the world. We've shipped factor to Iraq, to Afghanistan, Christmas Island, places I have to actually go hunt and look up where they exist, because we're getting requests from all over the world through email, through the website, but mostly through social media now. And people on social media are making friends with people in very remote places of the world. Thanks to Google Translation, they're able to communicate. It's amazing. It's just astoundingly amazing. So that's been one of the biggest developments. The other is the young people. It's like the rise of the young people. They're learning English, so they're not trapped anymore in little villages. Most of the people in developing countries have some kind of cell phone. And cell phone service in developing countries is dirt cheap compared to the U.S. So it is affordable. And a lot of them have cell phones, and they're able to access HTCs or organizations and request help to get on our radar screen. So I'm seeing this huge quantum leap in communication, which is eventually going to lead to better care. So that's been a huge change. And then finally, I think there's still areas where we have a long way to go. And back in 2000, it was Sub-Saharan Africa and the Caribbean. Those were two areas that were just I wouldn't say not recognized, but just not being addressed by the world groups, because it was difficult to reach everybody anyway. And typically you go where the call for help comes from. And we were not hearing from the Caribbean, and we were not hearing from sub-Saharan Africa. And if you went to a World Federation meeting, for example, back in the late 90s or 2000, you wouldn't see anybody hardly from those countries. So it was a glaring thing to me, and those tended to be the two areas that I focused on, with sub-Saharan Africa and Caribbean, to try to get help to them. Now it's a completely different situation where we are closing the gap in care, but we are being constrained financially and by the amount of factor we can donate. Companies like BioVeritiv have made an enormous difference with their pledge of 1 billion units to spread around the world through the World Federation. That helps them plan strategically rather than respond in a crisis-oriented mode all the time. That's going to make a huge difference. So rather than responding to people crying out for help, they're able to donate factor and say, look, we want these kids on prophy. We want you to step up to the plate, government of, whatever country, and make a pledge to help. So they're able to actually use donations strategically rather than in response to a crisis. And that makes a huge difference down the road. So these are all fantastic changes that are taking place.
So I want to start to wrap up by talking about what might be ahead in 2018 nationally and internationally. But just before getting to that, I wanted to ask you about the importance of young people working with Save One Life and being interested in the developing world. We are both very close to Chris Bombardier. He's a board member for Save One Life. As we know, he just recently climbed Mount Everest as part of the Seven Summits quest, and part of his reason for wanting to capture that meaningfully was to make sure to capture the disparity in care between the developed and developing world and show what is and is not possible when you have hemophilia, depending upon your access to care. So he's obviously a prime example of a young adult who's extraordinarily conscientious of the global community and how varied and dire in many situations the needs are. How important do you think it is that we as a greater community in the U.S. here continue to develop leaders like Chris who take a committed interest in community living in the developing world?
For me, I would say my point of view is it is the most important thing that we need to focus on. Chris Bombardier is a stellar leader, and if you meet him, you don't think of him as a leader. He's not self-promoting. He's not bombastic. He's humble. He's sincere. He has a core of steel, and he has a vision. And those are great qualities to have for a leader. He has now created or accomplished these stunning achievements in leadership. And these are physical achievements and mental achievements because he's overcome a lot. And you have to summit Mount Everest. It's physical and mental. So he is a role model of what a young person with hemophilia can accomplish in a developed country. And I'd love to see more people like him come forward because, I've told you this before, Patrick, I was your age when I got started too, and that was 30 years ago. My books, coming out with the books, these were all new things. No one had written a book before in the U.S. There was one book before that, but it was written by a doctor. And it wasn't really, it just didn't connect with me as a parent. So you create the things that you needed. That was 30 years ago. I just turned 60, and I still hope I've got a good 10 years left of providing help to developing countries and beyond, I hope. But, your body doesn't hold up as well. Right now I'm nursing a sprained ankle, and I've got to go into rehab. You guys have hemophilia. You've got your own issues, but you've got the energy. You've got the passion, the vision, it's seemingly like a boundless energy. I remember having that where your whole life is before you, and you want to get things done, and you want to make a difference in the world. You're looking forward all the time. At this age, we're looking back. A little bit forward, but we're looking back. And when we look back, we're like, wow, we did accomplish a lot, but we can't keep doing it. There's going to be a time when we're going to have to slow down and other things will take over. And we need young people to carry the torch. We need them. So I hope that people are inspired by you and what you've accomplished in such a short time, by Chris and what he's accomplished. And there's a lot of other young people out there, too, who have done some remarkable things. we really need them because the developing countries' needs are just profound, and my generation cannot accomplish it. We won't solve the problem. We're laying the groundwork, but we need all of you to continue building this model and bringing help to them.
So given everything that we've discussed now, as we think about saying goodbye to 2017, a year that at times has felt like it would never end, and saying hello to 2018, what's top of mind for you and from, say, an LA Kelley Communications national perspective, as well as a Save One Life global developing world perspective? What's 2018 have in store? What do you think?
Well, I think nationally, 2018, we're going to have some huge changes. I think there's, as we all know, there was a time when you could list 6 products for hemophilia. Now there's 29 products, more coming in the pipeline. The market can't sustain all of them, so there's going to have to be some fallout from this. And there are some products coming out that could be absolute game changers like nothing we've ever seen. So state chapters or hemophilia organizations are going to have to rethink funding. The national organization is going to have to look at funding and where they get their funds from. Patients have to look at what products they use. Should they try new products? Should they stay with their current product? They really need to engage with their hemophilia treatment centers and have a really good talk with their HTC team to talk about these new products and current products and what they want to use. People have to start learning more about insurance. There's going to, with the current administration, it's very unstable. We just don't know what's going to happen. It's very hard to predict anything. So the best, since we can't provide predictions, the best thing to do is to keep reading, keep listening, listen to your podcast, read what we print and put out there, talk to your local organization, find out as much as you can about your own insurance policy so you can protect yourself. All I can stress is keep reading, keep learning, keep talking, and then take some action. Take action for yourself, but also get involved with your local community because each of us has something to contribute. So I would say charity starts at home. Before we even think about developing countries, think about what the needs are in your own community. There are a lot of Americans who are hurting, and thankfully we've got fantastic organizations that offer help. But each of us can do something to help people locally too. And then if you're so inclined, the developing world is going to always be there and always need help. And there's help that can be given on so many levels. The World Federation is really the premier organization helping people in developing countries. If you have a special skill, you could offer it to them. They need help with their factor. They need financial assistance. They've been given this great gift of millions of units of factor, but they've got to ship it. It's incredibly expensive. It's one of our biggest line items for us at LA Kelley Communications is shipping out factor. The World Federation needs that kind of help as well. And factor really is the key to improving the situation in developing countries. And I guess lastly, I would hope that if anyone was so moved and feels a little overwhelmed by all the needs, the reason we call it Save One Life is we don't look at the 75% of the world's 400,000 with hemophilia. We look at one child at a time. What one child? Who would want to help one child? So we provide a means for an individual or family to assist one individual child overseas in need. And people can always check that out at our website. We have photos and stories of the children who are available to be sponsored. So you can take a local need and assist. You can go globally, big time with the World Federation, or you can help out one child at a time.
And we'll have links to Save One Life's website, saveonelife.net, as well as kellycom.com, LA Kelley Communications website, and all appropriate links will be in the program notes. So if you're listening and interested, just find those program notes in your podcast player and you can click along. Laurie also has kept a blog and captured through photo her trips for many, many years. So if you're interested to see what hemophilia around the world looks like, that I'm sure will be of interest. So again, you can find the links to these in the program notes. Just as a final kind of coda, Laurie, I heard you mentioned writing your book or writing books. Raising a Child with Hemophilia was the first, right?
Yes, it was.
Okay. And I've heard you mention that Raising a Child with Hemophilia and the founding of LA Communications was in response, at least in part, to your son being born with hemophilia and looking around for resources that didn't exist, and then you just created them. But for the moms and dads of newly diagnosed children today, is there one or two pieces of advice that you would like to share, or one or two pieces of information that you think are perhaps amongst the most important pieces of information for a newly diagnosed family?
Yeah, like I've always said in my books, and I guess this kind of advice is timeless. No matter if you lived in the 1980s or 90s or the 2000s, it's always you love your child more than anybody on this earth. So as the parent, trust your instincts. You've been given a set of instincts to take care of your child, so trust those. When your child's diagnosed, you're going to be facing a lot of authority figures, doctors, parents, teachers, doctors. It's easy to feel intimidated, but deep down you've got a voice that will tell you, when to step up and when to speak up, when to advocate for your child. So listen to that voice. And I guess I'd also say take action. Make sure that you always do something to keep learning and reading, learning about hemophilia, learning about treatment. Don't abdicate that responsibility to someone else, like a doctor or somebody else. Your child, your responsibility. You need to keep learning. And then lastly, get involved. There's support groups. There's wonderful, all kinds of, we never had this when my son was young. All kinds of wonderful events you can go to and meetings. There's so many options for you to do that we never had the opportunity to do. So I hope that everybody is able to attend something, because you'll meet the most wonderful community of people you'll ever meet in your life. And that's where so many parents say hemophilia is actually a blessing, because they've met lifelong friends, and it has become a family. And I think what you and I have realized is it's a global family. It extends around the world. But that's what I would say. Keep learning, keep reading, trust your instincts, and get involved.
Well, Laurie, thank you not only for spending time today for the Ask the Expert podcast to lend your perspective as we put 2017 behind us and move forward into 2018, but I also personally want to thank you, because when I think about 2017 and the highlights of this year for me, getting to work with Chris and with you and with the Nepal Hemophilia Society for Bombardier Blood, the documentary we're doing on Chris's climb of Everest, I don't see how that's not an all-time life highlight for me, regardless of where, as you said, there might be a long road ahead and there's a lot of looking forward, but I think I already know some of the forever moments in my life, and that time together in Nepal was certainly one of them. And not only the time together, but you're helping us get to that point and helping us find the way to bring this project into existence. I'll be forever grateful. So thank you for everything you've done for the community, for I guess I'll speak for Chris for a second, for Chris and for me. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to work with you. And again, you and Chris, guys like you are the future. So it's an honor to work with you, and keep doing what you're doing. It's fantastic.
Thank you. All right. Well, have a great rest of your Tuesday, and I'm sure we'll speak again soon.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you again, Laurie, for joining us today on Ask the Expert. I can't emphasize enough how uniquely informed Laurie's perspective is, and in case you missed this, she's pretty good at communicating that perspective too. So I hope you found her insights valuable, and don't forget to check out the program notes for this episode for links to Save One Life, Laurie Kelley Communications, and other sites that Laurie is responsible for. And that is all for episode 10 of the Ask the Expert podcast series. We'll be back next month, which is now also next year, with another expert interview. And just before going into the wrap up here, going to go off script for a second to just say that speaking of next year, that is a wrap on Ask the Expert for 2017. And I want to thank everybody who's been listening to this podcast this year for these first 10 episodes. As you may or may not know, 2017, we haven't had any funding to do this podcast. We have simply decided it needed to exist in the community, was a valuable resource, and much like Believe Limited did with stop the bleeding. Originally, we said it just needs to exist, and we're just going to drive it forward and make it happen. And that's what we've done with this podcast. Of course, we hope that we're able to find support for this podcast going forward. We want to be able to continue making it, and unfortunately, we cannot go on forever without support, but it's been an incredible first year. It was our fastest growing podcast for the second half of this year, and it's something that we are extraordinarily proud of, and that's because you listen and you find it valuable. If you didn't, we wouldn't do it because it would say, hey, no one's listening, and so we would have stopped a long time ago. But instead, our numbers say, actually, it's growing pretty quickly and people are responding to it. So thank you. I appreciate that you have a lot of choices when it comes to podcasts, maybe not in the bleeding disorders community, but in general, and thanks for spending some time with us. I commit to making sure that 2018 is at least as valuable as 2017 was here on the Ask the Expert podcast. Bloodstreammedia.com is your one-stop shop for all of Bloodstream Media's podcasts for the bleeding disorders community. Once on bloodstreammedia.com, don't forget to follow the links and subscribe to the Bloodstream podcast, the Ask the Expert podcast, that's this one, I can't even say the name of it, the Powering Through podcast, and the Bloodline podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play. How many can I name? I think that's off the top of my head, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Have an idea for a future episode of the Ask the Expert podcast? Have a question that you would like to hear an expert answer? Email us, mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com. You'll also find Bloodstream Media on facebook.com/bloodstreammedia and on Twitter @bloodstreaminfo. This episode of Ask the Expert was written by Patrick James Lynch, produced by Patrick James Lynch, Rob Bradford, Andrew Gall, Josh Bragg, Ava Friedman, and Cole B. Crow. Artwork by Ryan Geelan and Katie Wright Mead, and the Ask the Expert podcast is edited by Mr. Andrew Gall. Special thanks to Laurie Kelley. I'm your host, Patrick James Lynch, and until next time and next year, take self-care of yourself. Happy New Year.